One of the last pieces of the puzzle that we need to put together for how Strapi is going to fit into our Jamstack architecture is webhooks. I think webhooks are a really cool concept, and they enable some really powerful behavior in our stack. Webhooks allow you to notify applications on the internet when events occur in other applications. This can enable real-time communication between applications that otherwise have no methods of communication. Let's flip on over to the Strapi documentation and see how. I'm here on strapi.io on the left under Concepts, and then at the bottom, Webhooks. As I said, webhooks are a way for you to notify other applications that an event in your application has just occurred. This is done using an HTTP callback. So whenever an event happens that we have a webhook set up for, that triggers an HTTP request to be sent to whatever server we specify. I think this is a really clever concept. It's really cool and really lightweight, enabling really easy communication between applications. Webhooks are actually pretty essential to a functioning Jamstack architecture. Since all of the files in our Jamstack project are static and pre-generated, served directly from the CDN to our users, we need a way of knowing when the content that generates those static files has changed. That way we can trigger a new build with our static site generator, which will be Gatsby in this course, and then get an updated version of all of these static files pushed out to the CDN without us ever actually having to do anything manually. This is one of the big advantages of the Jamstack, and that simplicity enables you to iterate and build much faster than you would be able to in previous architectures, where every single time content would be changed, you'd usually need to set up a manual build and a manual deploy. Part of our continuous integration, continuous deployment setup is going to be using webhooks to actually notify our static site generator whenever there has been a change in the content of our site. We'll be using a webhook from our Git repository and a webhook from our Strapi server to make sure that our Gatsby site is always generated with real-time, up-to-date files. One thing to keep in mind though is you wouldn't want to set this up to rebuild your project if the webhook is going to be firing frequently, because you don't want to be building a new project at every 10 seconds or every few minutes if it's a very common action. So you want to be mindful of what the webhooks you're setting up are going to be used for and how frequently they're going to be fired. You see here that we can go and access the webhook configuration for our Strapi project under the Settings panel, under Settings and then Webhooks. Here in the documentation, they give us an example of how to create a webhook, where you can name it, specify the URL you want the request to be sent to, so essentially the service or server that you want to notify that an event has occurred, and then you can add headers to that request for more specification. Below that, you actually define what events you want your webhook to trigger for. Okay, so we can see here down below the available events, but first it shows that you can actually also set up a trigger test. So you can just test your webhook before you have it fully configured and make sure that the request goes through. Okay, and you can also enable or disable your webhooks. We'll scroll down here and you can see the available events that you can use by default in Strapi to send webhooks are for a content type being created, being updated, deleted, or a piece of media being created or deleted. You could imagine that we could set up a webhook so that every time a new product is uploaded, that will automatically trigger a new build in our project and get that project out on our live deployed site. There are lots of other interesting possibilities with this, So definitely start thinking of how you would use webhooks and what pieces of functionality you could build by knowing when your content types are modified. Just like with the last few examples, we're going to get into more specific details and implementations later on in the course, but for now, I just wanted you to be aware of this concept of webhooks as a mechanism for communication between otherwise independent applications. So being able to let one application know when something else happens in another application very easily over HTTP. Okay, so that's going to be an important mechanism later on, but that's about all you need for now. This just about concludes our overview of Strapi. And hopefully by now, you have really started to understand just how incredible of a platform Strapi is and just how much functionality Strapi is providing for us. Having all of this in one completely open source, JavaScript, customizable system is really going to enable some powerful patterns in both workflow and functionality. I'm really excited to show you guys how we're going to put all this together and how it's going to so easily allow us to scaffold out the back end of our application. Okay, but there's just one last thing, just a few considerations I'd like us to examine about how we should actually manage our data before we put it together. So let's check that out in the next video.